Welcome to this explainer. You know, whenever we talk about the massive shift artificial intelligence is bringing to the labor market, the conversation almost instantly veers into one of two wild extremes, right? Either it's this techno-utopian dream where nobody ever has to work again, or it's an absolute doomsday scenario of immediate mass unemployment. But what if we just completely drop those polarized anxieties for a second? What if, instead, we view this AI transition not as an impending apocalypse or some magical fix, but simply as a newly discovered, rapidly shifting landscape? And look, to survive and thrive in a new landscape, you don't need panic. You need a really good map. So today, we're going to explore exactly that kind of map, and we're going to navigate this new terrain together.
So, this brings us to a really brilliant new framework designed by futurist and post-labor economist Thorsten Mayer. It's called the Post-Labor Transition Atlas. As Mayer defines it, this atlas is the empirically grounded structural framework that this whole discourse has been desperately missing. Basically, to survive this terrain, business leaders and policymakers alike have to drop the hype and start thinking like impartial, data-driven mapmakers. We need to look at what's actually being measured, not just what people are arguing about online.
Okay, let's dive right into our cartographic journey today. We're going to cover navigating the new terrain, exposure versus actual displacement, the 4 weather patterns of transition, the policymaker's map, the map's legend, and finally, firm-level strategy.
Section 1. Navigating the new terrain. We'll start by looking at the baseline data.
Okay, get a load of this number. We are already seeing a 35.9% generative AI adoption rate among U.S. workers. Think about that. This isn't some theoretical projection for the year 2030 or beyond. This is the structural reality happening across organizations right now. More than a third of the workforce is actively integrating these tools into their daily tasks, which literally proves that the landscape is actively being reshaped by the very people walking on it.
Now, let's see how this actually builds into operational impacts on the ground. In 2025 alone, 55,000 U.S. jobs were directly impacted by AI-driven automation. And while that number definitely proves the terrain is actively shifting beneath our feet, it's also highly specific. It shows heterogeneous task-level displacement. So it's not a blanket wipeout of entire industries. Actually, it's more like a surgical alteration of specific roles, primarily in sectors like software engineering and white-collar professional services.
But hey, an accurate map shows the peaks as well as the valleys, right? Providing a counterbalance to that displacement is a massive surge of new creation. The World Economic Forum data highlights 350,000 emerging AI-specific roles popping up on the horizon. So for every valley carved out by automation, new, highly specialized peaks are forming. The real question for business leaders isn't just how to survive the valleys, it's how you're going to climb those peaks.
Moving right along to Section 2, Exposure versus Actual Displacement. This is all about the operational gap.
We really need to clearly define this crucial distinction: exposure versus displacement. Just because artificial intelligence can technically perform a task, meaning a role is exposed to AI, does not mean that society, governments, or businesses will actually allow AI to completely take over that role, and that actual takeover is displacement. Understanding this exact gap between what AI can do and what we let it do, that is the absolute secret to navigating your firm-level strategy right now.
If we compare that raw, theoretical AI capability against real-world frictions, the picture becomes incredibly clear. Think about healthcare administration or radiology. The AI might be fully capable of reading a medical scan, sure, but strict regulatory frameworks, intense legal verification needs, and complex compliance laws act as massive frictions. These frictions prevent total job replacement and instead force a reality of human-AI augmentation.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the Atlas grounds these concepts in the heaviest hitting datasets available. On one side, we have the May 2026 Frontiers Systematic Review, which distilled over 1,800 initial records down to 94 rigorously vetted studies. On the other side, we have the Goldman Sachs projections, which model about 300 million global full-time roles affected. But, and this is key, they only project roughly a 0.5 percentage point transition unemployment increase before things stabilize. These two pillars of data prove that our entire map is grounded in empirical reality rather than techno-optimist dreams or doomsday panic.
All right, Section 3. 4 weather patterns of transition. Let's look at the structural views.
So, economists don't all agree on the speed and severity of this arriving AI weather system. Here are the 4 distinct weather patterns they're tracking.
Pattern 1 suggests the transition is not arriving at scale, pointing to aggregate data that shows no massive employment decline yet. Now, contrast that with Pattern 2, which is arguably the most dominant interpretation right now. This pattern argues it's arriving slowly with heterogeneous effects, and this is backed by data showing a 3 percentage point unemployment bump specifically for 20 to 30-year-olds in tech-exposed occupations. Then we have Pattern 3, which sees the transition arriving fast but assumes structural alternatives like universal basic income remain unrecognized. Finally, Pattern 4 agrees it's arriving fast but argues that those structural alternatives are in fact operationally available to catch us. The beauty of the atlas is it doesn't force you to pick one. It impartially gives you the evidence for all four.
Section 4. The Policymaker's Map. Time to examine the global responses. As business leaders, we tend to look really closely at our own backyard. But I challenge you to step back and look at how different regions globally are building entirely unique shelters against this exact same AI storm. If you look across jurisdictions, geography heavily dictates the structural reaction here. The U.S. is largely leaning into a bipartisan workforce development framing, heavily focused on training and state-level experiments. The European Union, on the other hand, has taken a vastly different route with the EU AI Act's labor provisions and strong social protection baselines. Meanwhile, the Gulf states are leveraging a sovereign wealth model to address capital ownership and distribution. These are operationally tested, wildly distinct policy responses that multinational leaders absolutely must navigate. Section 5. The Map's Legend. We'll explore the 6 chromatic registers.
And this brilliantly illustrates how Mayer breaks the research down into 6 distinct registers to make it legible. You need a good legend for a complex map, right? So you have empirical clay for grounded forensic data, structural slate for jurisdictional policy frameworks, labor rose for specific wage and displacement economics, alternative sage for theoretical models like platform cooperatives, transition bronze for forward-looking forecasts, and synthesis deep for integrative conclusions. Breaking the data down into these distinct color-coded lanes makes a highly complex transition structurally legible for decision-makers. You know exactly what kind of evidence you're looking at instantly.
Finally, Section 6, Firm-Level Workforce Strategy. Let's talk workforce tactics.
So the crucial point is, how do we bring these massive macro policy observations down to the micro level of your own organization? Well, your operational survival depends on aggressively finding opportunities within those frictions we discussed earlier. You need to map the gaps, capitalize on the space between what AI can technically do and what the law, verification standards, and your clients will actually allow it to do. If a role is highly exposed but highly regulated, the strategic play isn't to fire your staff. Actually, scratch that. It's to equip them with AI to radically boost their output while maintaining the human verification that the market demands.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Look closely at your own organization today. Does your firm-level strategy actually account for the demographic heterogeneity we saw? Like the specific impacts on younger tech workers? Are you actively capitalizing on the exposure versus displacement gap? Or are you simply standing outside, reacting to the weather as it happens? The terrain has already shifted. It's time to pick up the map. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to dive deeper into the atlas to fortify your own post-labor strategy.